from London. This is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown, and my guest today is Filip Kovacevic. Filip is an intelligence historian and a professor in the departments of politics and global studies at the University of San Francisco. He's originally from Montenegro. He specializes in Russian and Eurasian intelligence history and spy fiction, and is the author of KGB Literati, a new book about spy novels written by people with backgrounds in Soviet intelligence. The idea of the book is to put these spies on the couch in the Freudian sense and reveal the inner essence of Soviet state security. Filip, your book begins with a reference to spycraft scholars. Who are spycraft scholars, and how did you become one?
Hi, Roland. Thank you for your invitation. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's a question about secrets. You know, when you study the intelligence world, you are faced with the world of mystery and secrets, and it's really difficult to do because materials are classified, and scholars like myself can only deal with the materials that are declassified by intelligence services, and typically they're heavily redacted. So essentially, it's like working on a puzzle. You are trying to put different pieces together and tell a fuller story about events from the past. Because as you know, so many of these events that we know about, we read from the history books, but typically the history books don't mention the work of intelligence agencies. In fact, if we go back, just one example from the past, think about the Enigma and the code breaking of Enigma, and how it took almost 30 years for the facts about Enigma to become known to the public, whereas the breaking of the codes contributed greatly to the Allied victory during World War II.
Yeah.
And this is
explain
why
what Enigma is for the.
Yeah, the Enigma was the German code during World War II, and it was broken by the cryptographers at Bletchley Park in the UK, and really played a crucial role in understanding the decisions of the German command, especially in connection to the U-boats. And this is something that was not known publicly up until the early 1970s. People say that Winston Churchill wrote so much about World War II, but he never mentioned the fact of the Enigma. So what I want to say is that studying intelligence history is very, very exciting, because you get to discover, if you're lucky, some of the things that made big difference in the past that pretty much nobody knew about.
So how did you get into this work?
Well, because I like secrets, and I like puzzles. It's like being an archaeologist. It's just you work with texts, you work in the archives. And now so many documents have been made digital and are available online. For instance, we talk about the CIA. There is the CIA Crest, and the FBI Vault, and also there have been documents declassified by the National Archives in the UK. And so there's a lot of document out there now in the digital form. But the old way is just going to the archives and seeing what's there, and hoping that you'll find something that's so interesting, that sheds new light on something that happened in the past. And in my case, I studied the KGB archives, the KGB operations and personnel, and it's a bit different, because the country that the KGB was supposed to defend collapsed. And some of the documents that belonged to the KGB were left in the former Soviet republics that have decided essentially to release them to the public. And this is not the case in Russia, so a lot of the materials that I deal with in my research has actually never been declassified in Russia, but it exists because it was left behind by the KGB in the former Soviet republics, like the Baltic states or Ukraine or Georgia. So in a sense, I as a historian of the KGB, I can get a kind of a better sense, a fuller picture of the KGB than, for instance, somebody who studies the CIA or the MI6, because all they get is just the redacted documents by the services themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess you're referring to, I believe it's originally a Lithuanian collection that's at Stanford. Is that right?
Yes, quite a lot. You know, the Lithuanian there is the Lithuanian Special Archives based in Vilnius, the capital of Lithuania, and they made a deal with the Hoover Library and Archives at Stanford University to essentially share some of their files, and this is how they got to Stanford, and I spend a lot of time studying them, and I study different operations and personalities, and what I'm really interested is the correspondence, communication between the Lithuanian KGB, which was a branch of the KGB based in Lithuania, and the central KGB based in Moscow, the Lubyanka headquarters.
Yeah.
Because the material from the Lubyanka headquarters is classified. However, this correspondence is not, and so sometimes by studying this correspondence, I can learn about the issues that were important at the time, not only in Lithuania but also in Moscow, which means for the Soviet Union as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's delve into the book. Let's start with some institutional history. So, the KGB was established in 1954, a year after Stalin's death. Before then, Soviet intelligence had run through a series of names and acronyms since the Bolshevik seizure of power in 1917. It was first called the Cheka, hence Russian intelligence agents still call themselves Chekists. It then became the GPU, the OGPU, NKVD, later overlapping formations NKGB, MGB, all of which, like the Cheka, were associated with degrees of Stalin's political terror and repression. The KGB was a post-Stalin rebrand, more interested in repression than terror, and still susceptible to institutional nostalgia. The most prominent institutional nostalgist around is obviously Vladimir Putin. But let's delve into your first protagonist, Roman Kim. Tell us about him.
Yes, so I studied essentially the KGB part, because the KGB had a different approach to controlling the Soviet Union. You know, if we talk about the KGB, we need to think about this gigantic system of social control, political control, physical control, psychological control, but the KGB wanted to develop kind of a softer approach toward that. They were interested, as you pointed out, not in terror, but in essentially control, mass control of consciousness, and so they've tried to develop different strategies to do that. One of which was spy fiction and counter spy fiction, and the reason behind that was to essentially to create the glorified image of the KGB as the savior of the Soviet Union, of the Soviet nation from the outside enemies. And so Roman Kim was one. Essentially, he began writing spy fiction essentially before there was KGB, because he was somebody who from even before World War II was interested in essentially the genre. He read a lot of British spy fiction writers, and they were really popular in the 1930s. And so he thought about developing a Soviet style of spy fiction, where instead of the Western intelligence officers winning and prevailing, it was the Soviet officers or the officers friendly to the Soviets who would be the winners. So essentially, he wanted to shape the hearts and minds of the Soviet people to like their own service, to see what their own service can do to protect them from the outside enemies. And of course, this was the big thing for all Soviet state security services, beginning with the Cheka, the idea that the Soviet Union was besieged by enemies, and that these enemies had their agents within the Soviet Union. Essentially, that's the essence of the Chekist worldview, this idea that these internal enemies of the regime, the critics of the regime, have to be connected to the outsiders, to the countries that want to break up the Soviet Union and destroy it. In fact, the Chekists admitted no internal genuine, authentic internal opposition to the regime. They thought they connected all the critiques to the outsiders, and therefore this is why they characterized the critiques within the Soviet Union as spies. And then there were the purges, these gigantic, very sadistic social phenomena where so many innocent people were accused of being spies with no evidence provided and executed. We are talking about hundreds of thousands of people. Roman Kim, he was a Korean who was born in Vladivostok, and he essentially was also a victim of the purges, but he was miraculously able to survive. And then in a certain sense he wanted to write these books not only as kind of the glorification of the Soviet state, but also as a kind of therapy. Because
you mentioned his survival. That's a good story.
Yes. He worked in counterintelligence, which meant that he was targeting foreign diplomats in the Soviet Union, and because he spoke Japanese, he was educated in Japan. He spoke Japanese really well, and so his job was to target the Japanese diplomats in Moscow. Mm-hmm. And so he had to spend a lot of time with them. He essentially had a whole network of agents spying on those diplomats, including the Russian language teachers, who were typically women. And there was also this issue of honey traps. In other words, the idea that these women would seduce the officers and try to get either obtain their secrets or blackmail them into getting the secrets to the Soviet state security. So Kim was extremely active in this milieu, the Japanese milieu in Moscow, and then in 1930s he was accused of being a Japanese spy himself. He was arrested, and he was essentially he was also tortured, as so many other people were at the time, and he essentially thought he was gonna be executed, and then he decided to the way to protect himself was not to deny, and this is I think what you were getting at. It was not to deny his belonging to the Japanese intelligence, but he said he was actually the chief of Japanese intelligence in the Soviet Union and an illegitimate son of the Japanese foreign minister. So that was his defense against the charges, complete opposite of what you would expect. But this idea that he was such an important person led to him being protected. In other words, he was not executed. He was kept in jail because his jailers, the other Czechs, they thought that he was such a valuable prisoner, because after all, he was the son of the Japanese foreign minister. So they kept him alive, and this essentially made him survive this first very, very brutal wave of purges. And later on, of course, different people were replaced at the top of the NKVD, and there was less repression. So he was still in jail. He stayed in jail all throughout World War II, but he was not in danger of being executed. In fact, he was given different assignments concerning translation and analysis of Japanese decisions, because this was a big issue at the time, whether Japan was going to attack the Soviet Union. This would probably have spelled the end of the Soviet Union had it been attacked from one side by the Nazis and their allies, and from the Asian side by Japan. But this did not happen, and Japan never really attacked the Soviet Union. And Kim said that his work was really important in getting the Soviet leaders to understand that, and essentially making them able to remove some of the Soviet troops from the Far East into Europe and the European part of Russia. So after the war, Kim was liberated from jail, and he thought about how to contribute to the Soviet state. It seems to me, this is difficult to understand. Why would somebody who spent so much time in jail and was even tortured now work on behalf of the same state? But perhaps he thought that the state was changing, and maybe he just wanted to prove to the Soviet leadership that he could be of use, that what they did was not correct, was not legitimate. And in fact, he was rehabilitated. he was rehabilitated, which meant that the Soviet state recognized that the accusations against him were false, were made up.
Yeah. Also, he didn't have a chance to leave, right? Presumably.
No, he
had
did
to
not.
make a life for himself.
None of them did. In fact, for any Soviet citizen, it was extremely difficult to leave the Soviet Union. Kim later became a member of the Soviet Union of Writers, which was the most powerful writers institution in the Soviet Union, and he was able to travel outside of the Soviet Union as a member of this organization, and he collected information. He was not a spy anymore. He said he wasn't. He collected information about his books, because his books, just like Ian Fleming's, they have a global focus. Kim's books, and I talked about them in my own book. I discussed their plots and their devices, narrative devices. They're about countries. They're not about the Soviet Union. They're about countries like the United States and Japan and China and even the United Kingdom. So what he wanted to do essentially is become a Soviet Ian Fleming, to create this genre, to be influential beyond the borders of the Soviet Union. However, his books were not translated into English, so he never achieved any kind of international fame, because he could not get his books into the English-speaking world. And it's interesting to speculate why that was. Perhaps even though he was doing all this work, he was not trusted enough to get his name out into the world, to make him better known in the world outside of the Soviet Union. However, he inspired a group of younger writers like Yulian Semyonov, who became well known in the West, the books of whom were translated into English. And Semyonov is also known for creating a character whom many people consider to be Soviet James Bond, and his name is Max Stirlitz, a Soviet undercover officer who poses as a Nazi officer during World War II, and because he's within the Nazi hierarchy, he could obtain secrets from the Nazis and then get them back to Moscow and enable successful operations by Soviet military and intelligence.
Yeah. Well, I found interesting about your account of Kim's fiction was that it sets out certain conventions which are later picked up upon by his successors. So, for example, when he writes about Western intelligence or the CIA, he's tying them to regimes which have committed atrocities, the Nazis, Imperial Japan. There's the idea that one of his Western villains is a drug addict, which actually reminded me of the claims that Kremlin media were making about Zelensky during the war in Ukraine, claiming that their opponent is a drug addict. U.S. nefarious in various ways, trying to exploit rare earths in Tibet through devious means, bringing Pearl Harbor upon themselves by being too anti-Soviet. So he writes this very, initially quite ideological fiction. Well, I guess it was all ideological. He starts in the 1940s in the Stalin era, late Stalin era, writing very rigidly ideological stuff. He experiments maybe a bit more in the post-Stalin years, but he's setting out these conventions which are taken up later.
Yes, that's a great point. In fact, that's why it's so important to study the KGB spy fiction, because, most of the same cliches and tropes and formulas are found in Russian foreign policy and domestic policy today. Because see, KGB created a set of conventions that are being used today to essentially perpetuate the same image. So, for instance, one of the cliches is this connection between Western intelligence and the former Nazis, which we also see being talked about today in connection to Ukraine, for instance, the war in Ukraine, or the idea that Western intelligence officers are immoral and are using drugs or alcohol or are bitter about their own organizations, whereas the Soviet officers are the opposites. They're ideal family people, moral citizens. They don't drink. They of course they don't even know what drugs
Yeah.
are, and they're completely faithful to their wives.
Yeah, I was struck by his. Well, he considered himself a scholar of spy fiction, was quite well read in Western spy fiction. I'm not sure how he accessed those novels. I'll ask you about that in a minute. But he described American spy novels as orgies of whiskey and blood, which to my mind makes them sound kind of cool. But not from a Soviet perspective. How had he encountered these works, by the way, these Western works?
Well, for him, because he was a former state security officer, he had access to Western literature.
He had privileged access.
In fact, if you look at the KGB educational institutions, the KGB spy schools, their libraries had Western literatures because and also magazines and newspapers, because they had to learn about the other side. They wanted to learn about their enemy, and so that's what they did. So Kim had access to the books, and he was an avid reader of American spy fiction, detective fiction, and he noticed the trend of, as he said, drugs and alcohol and blood and murder and violence and all of that. And of course, this is not what the Soviet citizens were supposed to be inspired by. So he had the Soviet officers be the very opposites. The Soviets, that it's like about being an intellectual. It's about being faithful. Even though you spend 10 years outside of the country, you're faithful to your wife, and you only think about her. And then you also, of course, play chess instead of bowling or any kind of game like that. So in other words, it was a way to create a model, a character that's inspiring to the young people of the Soviet Union, because this was the key. I mean, the key of any propaganda is to shape the hearts and minds of the younger generation, of the young people, students, of high school students, university students, because they are the new generations. They will be around after the old generations is gone. And Soviet Union, and of course the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, was really concerned about that. And so the KGB worked hand in hand with the Soviet Union to provide the framework for shaping of the hearts and minds of the Soviet population, essentially influence operations. So the KGB was not only a spy service, a counter spy service, it was also a gigantic apparatus for creating social influence, for influencing the hearts and minds. In fact, they had a special name for these operations. They were called active measures. And the active measures were directed not only toward the adversaries like the United States and the UK and later on even China, but also against their own population. And what the population was told is that here you have this group of very brave and courageous officers, the Chekists, who will do everything they can, even sacrifice their own lives, to defend you from these nefarious enemies, the enemies who are bringing back the spirit of Nazism. Because this is the kind of the most fundamental trope of Soviet and even now Russian foreign policy, this idea, this specter of Nazism, because of the tremendous suffering of the Soviet Union during the war, and millions of civilians getting killed and millions of soldiers getting killed. It's such a tremendous trauma that, of course, has been exploited for political purposes. And this is why it started with the KGB spy fiction, but nowadays it continues into the FSB spy fiction and SVR spy fiction. In other words, here in my book, I show you the origins of the whole thing. And now you can, after having read my book, you can follow the unfoldings of it in real time.
Right. So Roman Kim helps to establish a popular myth of the KGB and, as defenders of the fatherland and good wife guys. So your next protagonist is Zoya Voskresenskaya-Rybkina, who you refer to as ZVR for short. She was a high-level Soviet intelligence officer of the Stalin era, now a celebrated figure in Putin's Russia. She was involved in Stalin's efforts to carve off parts of Finnish territory before the Winter War. She married Boris Rybkin, the NKVD station chief in Helsinki. She was then involved with interrogating Polish officers after the Soviet co-invasion of Poland with Nazi Germany in 1939. Thousands of those officers, as we know, were murdered. She was also involved in analysis of intelligence that Germany was planning an attack on the USSR in 1941, which Stalin initially rejected. After the war, Rybkin, her husband, was killed under suspicious circumstances in Prague, and she went on to become a security officer in a brutal gulag in Vorkuta. Then, unexpected career term, she became a children's author who wrote hagiographic stories about Vladimir Lenin, the Soviet founder, as the archetypal Russian tradecraft professional. Tell us about her Lenin books.
Well, yeah. I mean, she's also an interesting figure, and I've selected these people because of their biographies and also their second career in spy fiction. And she was one of the very few women in the top ranks of Soviet intelligence. And was well connected during the war. She was based in Sweden and was essentially the main officer there, coordinating Soviet intelligence. She even spent some time in London during the war, and she used her time in London to go and visit the tomb of Karl Marx. And she talks about that in her biography.
I've been there, yeah.
And so she definitely was a great supporter of communism, and as she had to be. She was ideologically committed to the regime. However, she got connected with some wrong people in the 1950s. She was connected to the Beria network in state security, and as we all know, Lavrenti Beria lost his fight against Khrushchev and was arrested and executed. And some of his top people were also executed with him. Zoya Rybkina was able to avoid execution, but was demoted and sent to essentially to be one of the commanders at the Gulag camp. And after that, she retired. And then she decided to do something else. She decided to write about spies, but she could not do that. She was not allowed to do that because of the suspicions about her and her connections to Beria. And so the way she found, she had to think of a way to tell her story. She was a very experienced spy, and spies are very good at manipulating different things to do what they want to do. So she decided to manipulate this whole corpus of literature about Lenin to be able to tell spy stories. So she wrote about Lenin, superficially speaking, her books about Lenin and the early communists, the Bolsheviks. Stalin also makes an appearance, and many other Bolsheviks, including Felix Dzerzhinsky, the first head of the Cheka, the mythical Chekist, the ideal Chekist. So they're all there, but the fact is that she wanted to tell about her own life and her own tradecraft, and how she worked in her own field, just using Lenin essentially as cover. So she was essentially working undercover in literature to be able to publish her work. And so her Lenin is like a James Bond Lenin, minus alcohol and all the girls. So her Lenin is somebody...
Good wife guy.
Yes, definitely. Always loyal to his one and only Natasha Krupskaya. But he's so skillful in getting away from the Tsarist counterintelligence. He wears disguise. He pretends to be a German engineer. He speaks with the Russian with a German accent. He's just this master of transformation, ideal spy. He's able to get away at the last minute from the Okhrana, looking for him. And it's essentially, so what you get essentially is a kind of Lenin that a young child, young student in the Soviet Union would identify with. So in other words, she was using her. Essentially, it was an ideological tool to get young Soviet people to develop sympathy for the early Bolsheviks and what they did and how successful they were. And indeed, they were successful. They did come to power and were able to establish their regime. And so she got a lot of awards for her work. But so many people never realized until, of course, the end of the Soviet Union that she was also telling her story of her own experiences in the spying business. Because, it was not known that she was a former intelligence officer. And Roman Kim is the same. That's the same case. It was not known in the Soviet Union that these people worked for state security at one point in their careers. I mean, the Soviet Union was the empire of secrecy. So many things were classified. There were even whole cities off the map, completely classified. And this is something we have to take into consideration, that the public knowledge about the system, knowledge about politics was extremely restricted, was extremely manipulated, and people's minds were extremely manipulated by the Czechs and the others. Of course, the Communist Party had a leading role, but the KGB was one of the pillars of the Soviet regime. In fact, it was called the fighting unit of the party, the shield and sword of the regime. That's essentially the main metaphor. The main metaphor for the Soviet state security is the shield and sword. Which is also on their logo, right? Yes, that's exactly their main slogan, and that's how they thought of themselves, defending the country and also, if necessary, attacking their enemies. However, I have to mention that there was a lot of shield and a lot of sword, and sometimes the sword was more prominent than the shield. And in fact, one of the essential elements of KGB operational mentality was called in Russian nastupatelnost, which means offensive posturing. In other words, the idea was that the attack is the best defense. So even though the KGB projected this image of being first the defenders and then the attackers, in fact, in their operational practice, they preferred the attack rather than defense.
Yeah. Very interesting point about how Soviet citizens were not necessarily in a position, to judge what they were being told, whether in Pravda or in fiction. So when the West is presented in a certain way, they can't do the fact checking.
Yes, that's a great point. You had only one side of the story. I mean, it's important to point out that all intelligence services like to have a positive portrayal, positive depiction in the media. But the Soviet Union had only one side of the story. Where in the West, I mean, we can just compare, Ian Fleming and John le Carré. In Ian Fleming, you get this heroic individual, James Bond, who is, just so successful in defeating all the enemies of the West, the mafia types, the organized crime, as well as the rogue Soviet officers. Interestingly, there's never kind of direct confrontation with the actual Soviet Union. And then you have Le Carré, who essentially wrote about the kind of the underside of intelligence agencies, the loneliness and cynicism and pessimism and kind of the lack of a positive vision in intelligence agencies. But you have both in the West, whereas in the Soviet Union you had only one side, and if you even thought about something different, you were called to the KGB. If you were a young writer trying to publish something like that, first of all, you could not because of the censorship, and secondly, you'd probably be invited to have a conversation, what's called prophylactica in Russian, a conversation with a KGB officer who would advise you to stop doing that or else.
Yeah. Let's look at how the tradition continues. So in your next section, you have Oleg Gribanov, who was head of the KGB's second chief directorate, which looked after domestic counterintelligence from 1956 to 1964. He was, fair to say, a hardliner who took office after Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalin. But it seems to me that he was a Stalinist to the core. He'd begun his career hunting supposed Trotskyists in the 1940s. He'd been personally favored by Stalin. He seems like a pretty dark and malign character who has a special interest in the creative use of entrapment to target diplomats and other foreigners so as to expose and embarrass foreign rivals, particularly using the aforementioned honey traps. Then for reasons unclear, but possibly having to do with Khrushchev's ouster by Brezhnev in 1964, he's kicked out of the KGB and the Communist Party in apparent disgrace, turns to writing spy fiction under the pseudonym Oleg Shmelyov with a colleague named Vladimir Petrochenkov, who writes under the pseudonym Vladimir Vostokov. Tell us about how they changed the genre.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for mentioning Oleg Gribanov. He essentially is seen as one of the most legendary figures in Soviet counterintelligence. He is described as having an ominous talent, to create operations against Western diplomats, and he himself personally took part in those operations. He played the role of a Soviet government official. So he was, even though he was the head of the whole thing, he wanted to be in the field, and he wanted his officers to be very creative in these operations. In fact, he played with reality the way some people play with words. And this is why after he was essentially fired from the KGB in connection to certain intrigues within the Soviet leadership, he turned to spy fiction because he could no longer manipulate the real life. So he decided to manipulate the hearts and minds of the people by publishing very patriotic spy fiction where the Western officers sent to the Soviet Union are turned against their own services, become essentially doubled by the KGB, are sent back to the West, and are now essentially penetrating their own services. So, and his novels written in tandem with Petrochenkov show that they show the craft, they show the tradecraft of Soviet counterintelligence, and they show how the KGB was able to manipulate all aspects of Soviet life. KGB had its own officers in all Soviet institutions. They could make anything possible. They could manipulate the courts. They could manipulate the state enterprises. They could manipulate the transportation system. So what they were able to create for this Western officer who is essentially sent secretly, clandestinely sent into the Soviet Union, a completely different world, and were able to get him essentially arrested, get him caught, even though he has had a lot of expertise, and then get him to turn to essentially to begin working for the KGB. And this officer in particular was Russian. He was a son of a former Russian nobleman who was exiled from Russia after the Bolsheviks came to power. But now his son, working first for the West is being turned by the KGB and recognizes kind of that his real country is Russia. And this is something important because this is exactly what the current Russian regime under Putin is trying to do with Russian diaspora, Russians living outside of Russia. They're trying to stress that they cannot be working for the West. They are deep down there Russians and have to work for the good of the Russian state. So what Gribanov did in these novels is show this transformation, this seeing the light. You have somebody who essentially works for the BND or the CIA and has discovered his Russianness and is saying no more of this, and is now working for Russia, for the Soviet Union, against his former employers and passing on information that's very, very useful for the KGB and for their own operations, because that's the best thing that the service can have, is a penetration of the adversary, the penetration of the enemy service, because then you get the secrets directly from the people who are working against you. This, of course, is the most difficult to do, but the KGB has done it. In real life, the KGB has had Aldrich Ames, who recently passed away, and Robert Hansen, who were working, one for the CIA and the other for the FBI, from the inside and passing on the secrets to the KGB. Yeah. So Gribanov in himself, I've chosen him because of his biography, and he was first talked about in John Barron's excellent book from the 1970s called The KGB, where Gribanov's operation against the French ambassador Maurice Dejean in Moscow is described in detail. And it had to do with what you mentioned, it's a honey trap. Essentially, there was a Soviet actress, a well-known Soviet actress, one of the best-known of Soviet actresses, who was an agent of the KGB and who was given an assignment to seduce Dejean.
What was her name?
And her name is Larissa Kronberg. She passed away recently, and so she, talk about KGB penetration of the artistic world in the Soviet Union. I mean, KGB had their own people among the artists, among the writers, among the musicians, among the painters, among the whoever. The athletes. Who were, for one reason or the other, sometimes they were themselves blackmailed into working for the KGB, and sometimes they wanted the money and prestige, because let's face it, the KGB had the money, had the prestige. Being a member of the KGB, being an officer of the KGB was extremely prestigious in the Soviet Union, and of course, working for the KGB had its share of benefits. So this actress agreed to do this, and according to John Barron, Maurice Dejean was caught. He was caught essentially in bed with her and by supposedly her husband and his friend, who were of course not her husband and his friend. They were KGB officers dressed up as geologists, because her husband was supposed to be a geologist. But they came back from their expedition earlier and they found them, whereas in fact everything was set up. Just this is like real life, like fiction. This is what's so eerie about Gribanov, that he approached real life as fiction. He created these elaborate operations where he himself played the part. And so he, once he could not do it in his job, he began writing spy fiction with some help from other people, and created these novels that are still considered among the best novels about Soviet counterintelligence in Russia. And I have some information that they are still being read by the FSB officers, and the films based on them are watched at the Russian counterintelligence academies and intelligence academies, and they are studied because of the creative potential. And this is something that Gribanov is famous for. And I found this in the archives. I found a transcript of the meeting of Soviet counterintelligence in 1955. Nobody has known about this before. And in this meeting, there is Gribanov saying in his own voice, Gribanov being quoted saying, you've got to be creative. You can, and he says, and I quote this in my book, he says, you can come to work on time and you can follow all the instructions you get from your superiors. But if you are not being creative, you are not an authentic intelligence officer. So here is creativity and imagination being used for the evil things, for the nefarious purposes, which is so interesting, because imagination, we all talk about it in literature and how important it is in literature, but it could be used for good and also for bad. And Gribanov had this ominous talent to use it for nefarious, very repressive purposes.
A couple of observations. An observation and a question. So the first is to do with the portrayal of any Russian working for foreign intelligence, or maybe even living abroad as a part of the diaspora, as inauthentic, going against themselves. It strikes me as kind of fitting onto a pattern of Russian Orthodox thought. Now, I know that the Soviet Union was officially atheist, had an atheist ideology, but the idea that Russian Orthodoxy was about the glorification of the state seems to underlie that. The question was to do with Gribanov and honey traps. I don't know to what extent honey traps were portrayed in his novels, but there was that Soviet reticence about portraying sex in media. So how did he deal with that, if at all, in fiction?
Well, when he spoke about sex in his fiction, it's the other people doing it, not Soviet officers, not
the bad wife guys on the other side.
Yes, exactly. So that's so that's how he dealt with that. But in terms of your comment, I think that's very important to emphasize, is the idea of collectivism. This is something that you find in Russian Orthodoxy, but also you find in communism. The idea that the individual is to be sacrificed for the good of the collective. So KGB essentially follows this same tradition, the kind of a communist tradition, where you had this idea that you can do something great, but you are just a cog in the machine. You are working for the greater good of the state, of the regime, of the Communist Party. You're working for something bigger than yourself. So there is no praise for individual achievement in the KGB. And if we look at some of their greatest intelligence officers, they did not receive any kind of glorification in real life. They were seen as doing their duty for the state, and this is something that's emphasized today. Even though today there is no communist ideology, but there is this ideology of nationalism in Russia, the greater Russia, the mother Russia, the father Russia, and all of that. So you've got to do it for that. And so today, the ideology today is one of nationalism rather than communism. Communism had this internationalist dimension, and you see that in fiction. You see that in fiction, for instance, of Roman Kim. He has not only the Soviet officers, but also Soviet allies. For instance, he has a book about Korea, the Korean War, and the main protagonists are not the Soviets, who were not supposed to be in Korea in any case, but the North Koreans, the North Korean communists, who are seen as the saviors of their country from the evil imperialists who are working, the Americans who are working with former Japanese fascists and who are turning into their former enemies. So you have that the allies. It's not only so for the Russian fiction today, Russian FSB fiction today, there are not so many allies as in the past. And in fact, the KGB had this advantage of having an internationalist ideology that they could use to manipulate their potential agents in the West. Because so many intellectuals, and George Orwell talks about them, they worked for the Soviet Union, not because they cared about the Soviet Union per se, but they cared about this idea of having a socialist system, a workable, livable socialist system come into existence, the system where you would get according to your needs, whatever you need, and then contribute according to your abilities, where you would not be forced to spend hours and hours in meaningless, empty jobs, where life would finally have some significance. And that, of course, was their greatest illusion and delusion. And some of them paid for it very dearly, including with their lives, if they decided to move to the Soviet Union. That was the end of them.
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the really interesting sections in the book is to do with the Chekist stories. So in 1969, Yuri Andropov, KGB chairman, sets up the KGB Press Bureau and sets it to the task of popularizing the KGB, vetting its representation in media. One of the projects that emerges is a series of anthologies published under the title Chekist Stories between 1969 and 1991. These are written by a range of people with either intelligence backgrounds or privileged access to archives. What's interesting about those books is that you really see the conventions of the genre being entrenched, continuing to establish themselves, along with certain taboos and avoided topics. So tell us about those conventions of the genre.
Now, this is very important because this is the KGB Press Bureau. It's a very important institution, you know. So Yuri Andropov did not initiate the idea of KGB pretending to have a human face for the Soviet population. This was initiated by his predecessor, Vladimir Semichastny, in the early 1960s. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in my book, I talk about documents where I talk about the actual KGB plans to manipulate the presentation of the KGB in all kinds of media, including literature.
Yeah.
But Andropov wanted to expand that. He wanted to make it institutionalized. So he set up something called the KGB Press Bureau, which began playing the main role in influencing the hearts and minds of the Soviet people to like the KGB, to respect the KGB, to think that KGB is very professional, to think that the KGB officers are sophisticated thinkers and master spies. And so in my research I found that their main project was the Chekist Stories book series. It was 8 volumes, more than 4,000 pages altogether. So each volume was published in 100,000 copies. So we are talking about this gigantic print runs. The KGB wanted to make sure that every Soviet kid had access to Chekist Stories, that all the libraries across the Soviet Union had Chekist Stories, that there was so much about Chekism that a young boy, not a girl, by the way, because we have to keep in mind that the KGB was a male-dominated institution, so that a young boy would say, I want to be a Chekist. And so the press bureau was there. They found writers, journalists willing to work for them. They also had their own people write about their experiences through the prism of ideology. Of course, not what really happened, but what should have happened according to their own communist ideology. And of course, you can always, if you study these stories in detail the way I did, you sometimes discover authentic potential, authentic events in them. If you can compare them to documents, and in a couple of cases I was able to do that. However, most of the stories we don't really know, but we get the sense that the Chekists were in charge, that no enemies, no domestic enemies could get away. These agents, these bad Soviet citizens who liked Western music and Western movies and Western perfumes and all of that. And so they were in the Chekist Stories. Chekist Stories were less oriented. They were not oriented toward the outsiders. They were completely focused on the Soviet population. And as you pointed out, they were published for more than 20 years. The last one came out ironically, in 1991, when the whole country fell apart. So see the system just kept working on and on, even though the reality no longer reflected whatever they were talking about. However, let me tell you this, that the Putin's Russia in the last couple of years, they began republishing these Czechy stories. In other words, an amazing thing happened that while I was writing the book, some of these stories came back into the public life. They began to be accessible. You know, when I started out, these Czechy stories were out of print, long out of print. They were difficult to find. Now a young person in Russia could access them because they have been recently republished. So it's an amazing thing is happening. There is this recycling of the past that I myself did not expect. You know, I thought I was perhaps writing about Russian past, and actually I am now. I see that I have been writing about Russian future. It's like future because the past has now become the future. That's a horrifying thought, but it is happening. Yeah. It is happening as we speak. But what was presented by the KGB was manipulated to begin with, because there is this old joke that the Soviet history is so difficult to study because they keep changing it all the time.
Yeah.
And the same with Russia, with Putin's Russia. They keep changing history all the time, and so they are now having the Czechies back because they want this cult of Czechism. Dzerzhinsky is back. The statue, there was a big statue, 40 feet statue of Dzerzhinsky standing in.
Right, I remember when it used to be in the sculpture park in Moscow.
Yes. Now a replica of it. So there was this statue, huge statue in front of the Lubyanka headquarters in Moscow. The main KGB
so it had been torn down.
But now, just 2 years ago, a replica of it, a smaller replica, was placed in front of the headquarters of Russian Foreign Intelligence Service at Yasenevo. In other words, they brought it back, and I would not be surprised if they brought it back to the original position in front of the Lubyanka, because from what I could see,
there's been a lot of talk of it.
Yes, the talk is in the news, and so many former Czechies. And let's not forget, Vladimir Putin is a former Czechist. If there is such a thing as a former Czechist, and that's a big question, because once a Czechist, always a Czechist. In other words, there is this spirit of Czechism that connects you to this group, because they thought of themselves as a knightly order, as a kind of a cult, a secret society. So there is this issue of belonging. However, they were defectors. So it's not as if there were no defectors. There were defectors. There were even KGB officers who supported the dissidents, but very few. If you look at percentages, very few there were, but not so many compared to 500,000 people who worked for the KGB in the 1980s. And here I'm talking only about the officers. You have to add the agents, confidential contacts, occasional contacts. So we are talking about millions of people in the Soviet Union who were connected, who were plugged into this system of repression, which has never been completely dismantled. And this is why the KGB is able to come back. This is why the KGB has been so resilient, is because it has never been completely dissolved and dismantled. And the way I compare it to the ancient Greek Hydra. You cut off, Hercules cuts off one head, but there is another popping up, because the heart is still beating, and the heart is one of social control and manipulation. That's the essence of it.
Right. Your book mentions a kind of continuity thesis, the idea that whatever the relations between states are at a given time, the intelligence war is continuing. And, well, reading your book, throughout the reading of your book and the accumulation of a sense of what the cliches and conventions are, I see them playing out all the time in Ukraine and in the Kremlin propaganda about Ukraine. So maybe a good note to end on is what your takeaways are for the present. So what have you learned through this project that should be applied to the present?
Well, that's a very difficult question. Historians typically talk about the past and how the past influences the present and the future, but it's very difficult to predict the future. But then again, you can bet that the future is mostly the repetition of the past, especially if no fundamental changes have been made. And I don't see them. I mean, if you look at the post-Soviet Russian developments, political developments, ideological developments, you just see one collectivist ideology being replaced by another. Communism being replaced by nationalism. And it's using, as I pointed out, they are using the same formulas, the same tropes, essentially the same narratives in many cases to propagate the same image of subordination of the individual to the state. I think this is a key philosophical thing. Subordination of the individual to the state. And this is exactly what Orwell fought against. I mean, his project was about the free thought of an individual, of being an individual. So now the question is, how do you inspire the birth of or the resurgence of individualism in Russia? Well, books could be a part of it. And in fact, the CIA had a whole strategy, a whole project during the Cold War of sending of covertly smuggling books into the Eastern Bloc, into Poland, into Czechoslovakia, into Soviet Union, books that talked about a different world, a different dimension of thought, and inspiring people to organize and then do something about that. I mean, without people taking charge, nothing can be done. From the outside, there has to be this internal impulse, and sometimes it takes decades and decades. I mean, if you can go back to Lenin and his group of Bolsheviks. I mean, when they were successful, Marx was long dead. In other words, for the movement itself, it took decades to be able to show itself effective in real life and come to political power. So the same here. It's probably going to take decades and decades for some kind of substantive psychological social change. Of course, political changes could happen, and they're sometimes connected to the biological life of leaders. And so we
yes, thankfully,
and so I mean, we talk about the Czechists, former KGB people that I mentioned in my book are now in their mid-70s. They're now in their mid-70s. People like Putin, Bortnikov, Narishkin, and others, who are essentially running the Russian system today, the Russian regime today, are in their 70s. So we also need to be thinking about the biological changes there, the biological clock that's ticking, but without more substantive changes in social life, which are brought about by encouraging individualism and creativity in the good way. There could be Putin after Putin. In other words, there could be a mini Putin, and I can just speculate. I have no evidence of that, but there could be another generation of Czechists. In other words, there could be the sons of the current Czechists, or even grandsons of the current Czechists. In other words, the Czechists could find their own replacement in their own group, the FSB, the SVR, and others. And I would essentially expect that. I would expect that the successors to Putin would also come from the same milieu connected to the Czechists.
Yeah. Well, it brings to mind the phrase garbage in, garbage out. In other words, if you have highly ideological fiction and you foist it upon generation after generation, and you limit their ability to perceive alternatives, then you get a leader like Vladimir Putin, who, as Angela Merkel said, lives in another world.
Yes, exactly. And we need to study why this fiction is so effective, because it is effective. It is one dimensional. Is what is it? Fear, connection to could be stability, fears, could be issues like that. So there is a lot to think about, and but I'm glad that in my book I covered the origin. So now, but not the ending. Even though I do say that to dismantle this kind of mechanism, ideological mechanism, it's going to take a long time.
Thanks very much, Philip.
Thank you, Roland. I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, let me share some information. So the book is KGB Literati, Spy Fiction and State Security in the Soviet Union from University of Toronto Press. Philip's Substack is kgbstack.substack.com. You can find him on X at ChekistMonitor. His blog is thechekistmonitor.blogspot.com. You can follow me on the Orwellian Substack at theorwellians.substack.com. I'm on X at Roland E. Brown, Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown, and you can find my long-form articles in New Lines magazine. Thanks very much, Philip.
Thank you so much.